What is a heroic wine? And how did Spanish rule change the wines of Italy? And why is wine diplomacy a form of nation building? Well, tonight you're going to get those insider tips and stories and more. If you're watching this video on the replay, please, in the comments, type the word replay. Where are you logging in from? I want to hear from you. And of course, if you're here with me live, I want to hear from you as well. What's the weather like? What's in your glass? I'm Natalie MacLean, and I teach online wine and food pairing courses, and you've just joined one of the most passionate groups of wine lovers who gather every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern to talk to the most interesting people in the world of wine, like our guest, whom I'll introduce momentarily. So I'm live streaming this video for the first time. I'll be live in the comments, but it's based on a recording for my podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk. But as I mentioned, I'll be answering your questions, so get in there. I want to hear from you. What stories are you enjoying? What tips are your favorite? Are there questions that we haven't answered? Let me know. And before I introduce our guest, let me say that 3 of you are going to win a copy of his terrific new book, Italy in a Wine Glass, the story of Italy through its wines. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com and tell me you'd like to win a copy. I'll choose 3 people randomly from those who contact me. All right, back to our guest. Marc Millon is a food, wine, and travel writer for numerous magazines and books. In addition to his new book, some of his others include Wine, A Global History, The Wine and Food of Europe, The Wine Roads of Europe, and A Taste of Britain. Marc hosts a weekly podcast called Wine, Food, and Travel with Marc Millon on the Italian Wine Podcast channel. And he joins us now. Now, Marc, you are you're close to Devon. You're not in London, but for those of us who are not familiar with where you are, welcome, but let us know where you are.
Oh, well, it's so nice to be here. So nice to see you, Natalie. I'm on the River Exe, which comes down from the city of Exeter towards Exmouth in the sea. So I'm very near the south coast in Devon, beautiful Devon. It's one of the most beautiful parts of England, I think. I've been living here for more than 45 years, so we love it.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I've heard things about how beautiful the landscape is there and the coastline. Before we dive into your wine career, let's chat a little bit about your childhood. You were born in Mexico. What did your father do?
My father was an archaeologist, so he went down to Mexico. Well, I was born in the 50s, and he went down he was fascinated by ancient civilizations and by the pyramids north of Mexico City, the city of Teotihuacan. Although in the 50s it wasn't considered an urban area, but my father believed that you couldn't have monumental architecture without urbanization. So he set about mapping the city, and it was his life work. He was a professor eventually at most of his career at the University of Rochester, New York, so not that far from you. And he spent his life mapping the ancient city of Teotihuacan and proved that it was actually the biggest city in the New World. So it was an immense task he undertook. But for a young boy growing up, I mean, I only lived there for 2 years as a baby, but then we would spend our summers there. So I spent summers running up and down pyramids.
That's something most people can't say. That must have been wonderful. My goodness, what a magical childhood. And you obviously picked up his love of history. Now, your mother's side was Korean. How did that influence you?
Well, my mother was born in Hawaii, but her mother, my grandmother, emigrated to Hawaii when she was only 16 years old. She came over for adventure. She was a picture bride. And
what does that mean, picture bride?
Well,
is a catalog?
Virtually, she chose a picture of somebody to marry who was working in Hawaii, a Korean in Hawaii, and came over as a picture bride when she was only 16 years old. And she was a very strong character. She became a businesswoman in Honolulu. She was there, of course, during the time of Pearl Harbor, when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And she was a successful businesswoman. And it was such a it was a story we didn't know as children so much. My mother, being second generation, didn't really tell the story of her past so much. But it was a story we wanted to know. So my wife and I, when our son was only 6 months old, we spent a lot of time with my grandmother, and we wrote a book about my grandmother called Flavors of Korea, with stories and recipes from a Korean grandmother's kitchen. So it was a food memoir. It was her story, but it was also sharing my mother's story and my story. So in some cases we'd have 3 recipes for the same food, bulgogi, Korean barbecue, for example. The way my grandmother did it, the way my mother did it, and the way we do it.
Oh, I love that. What a great narrative thread as well to draw through those recipes. Now, you were just 19 when you arrived in England 50 years ago.
Yes.
Describe what was happening then for you.
Well, I came over, Natalie, for 1 year, for my junior year abroad. So I never intended to still be here all these years later. England in the 70s, and being in an English university was very, very different. For a start, the food was really, really bad. It was as bad as English food had the reputation to be. But I think that was institutional cooking, because English food is actually very, very good now, and very exciting. But yeah, it was a totally new experience. The culture was very different. The accents were very different. But within a few months of arriving, I met a wonderful 19-year-old who eventually was to become my wife and my partner in work as well. And that's how I ended up staying here. I went back to finish college. I was an English major and returned the following year. My wife was studying English and fine art, specializing in photography.
Wow, that's great. Now, the early days that you spent as a writer were pre-internet. So, no email, no internet. How did you make do? Like, what kind of, I was going to say kludges, but that's a very technical term. How did you, what were the challenges of working back then as a writer?
Well, Natalie, I think because we didn't know anything else, we didn't
True.
know what we were missing. But for example, I talk to students sometimes now about what I do, and many of them have never ever seen a typewriter. They don't know what a typewriter is. It's something that you would actually see in a museum. Well, I wrote my early books on a typewriter. We had to write a lot of letters. To make appointments, you wrote letters. You didn't even pick up the phone. It wasn't that easy to travel around to contact people in France and Italy, even by phone. So we wrote a lot of letters. We planned. It was very different. The traveling was different as well. We didn't have sat-nav to move around, going around all the great wine regions of Europe. So yeah, it was difficult, but it was definitely doable. I don't think you can ever go back to doing things the way they were. Exactly. I used carbon paper to make 2 copies of my manuscript to deliver to my publisher. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
In a way, though, there's almost a longing for that slower pace, more contemplative, more reflective. But I'm with you, though. I don't think I could do without the tools I have now, having had them. But and just to wrap up that, you also were traveling with a young family at one point. You mentioned you toured all of France and Italy for 2 years in a VW camper van with a trailer and 2 young children and a nanny named Polly. I don't know how you did it. I mean, I can't imagine that small space with, 5 people?
It was difficult. That was a very, very hard project. It was a very important project. There were 2 huge books They were called the Food Lovers Companion France and the Food Lovers Companion Italy. So covering the whole of both countries within 2 years, 500 photographs in each, which my wife was taking. But of course, this was film, Natalie, so we had to keep the film in the little tiny refrigerator that had to be DHL'd back to the UK for somebody to put in the refrigerator here. And it was quite a pressured project that was more difficult with a 6-year-old and a 1-year-old. That said, my children were absolutely wonderful, and it really shaped their character as well. And I really wouldn't have wanted to have done it in any other way. We were married for 10 years before we had our children, and I think we probably wrote 5 books, published 5 books within that time, 4 or 5 books. So it was difficult, but like writing a book without the internet, it was possible, and it's who we were and what our family was, and if we wanted to do what we did, which we did, then we just had to find a way. And Polly, our nanny, was very, very good, and she's still a dear friend. We see her frequently.
I imagine she was very compact too as a woman. You couldn't have had someone taking up like a 6'5" nanny.
No, actually, anyway. You're right. She was very small, and the children were very small.
Yeah. So let's jump into your latest book about Italian wines. What drew you to this story in the first place? I mean, you've been writing about Italy, its wine and food for a while, but what drew you to this story for this newest book?
Well, that's a really good question. And I have to say that I have to go back about 30 years when I was writing, probably when I was writing The Wine Roads of Italy, and then subsequent other books, and I had a magazine column. But what I kept coming across, Natalie, was that Italian wines can't be looked at outside of the context of the people who make them and the places they come from, but also the history behind them, the history of the areas, the history of the people, the history of the country. And I was getting a sense that really the history of Italy can be explored through wine. And that's really the basis of this book. History, it's telling the story, it's not the history of wine, it's telling the story of Italy through wine. So it's history and wine.
Yeah, I love that. And that's obviously a central part of what makes this book different from others. But are there other aspects of this book that would make it very different from other books about Italian wines?
Well, I think this focus on history is quite unique. And the breadth of the book, I mean, we go from the ancient Greeks to COVID, and indeed to beyond, looking into the future even. So it's quite a sweeping time span, but it works. The wines fit naturally in to all of these different periods and personalities and movements and events. I think in a very natural way, because the wines are so intimately entwined with the story of Italy.
Yes, they tell some wonderful stories, wonderful characters. What was the most surprising insight that you learned or discovered while you were either researching or writing the book?
I think an insight that is really part of who Italians are is how proud Italians are of, and how knowledgeable they are of their own past, of the past of their locality. They'll talk about events that happened hundreds of years ago as if they happened yesterday. I was sitting on a bus next to, I was at Vinitaly, and we were taking the bus to the big exhibition hall. And I sat next to a wine producer from Calabria, an area I hadn't been to, a part of a wine zone I hadn't even heard of. And she told me in a very gentle voice, she said, Federico II, that's Frederick II, the Hohenstaufen Holy Roman Emperor, she said he built a castle in her town, and she talked about him so fondly as if it was her own son. And that's the sort of stories you would come across again and again and again. This pride in history and story, and I think this pride and identity. These events, this history, these wines are the part of the identity of the Italians from wherever they're from in the country, and that's a wonderful thing to have that sense of identity. And I think for those of us who have moved around a lot in life, social mobility is much greater in our countries, to have that solidity and that sense of continuity, not just with place, but across the centuries, is quite extraordinary and remarkable and wonderful.
I love that story. It really brings to life that identity and the recency kind of thing. What's the most interesting thing someone has said about your book so far? I know it's just new out into the world, but have you had any feedback on it?
Well, I think what's been most gratifying for me is I took the book to Vinitaly this year, and I was able to present the book at some master classes that I undertook, and what I think was most gratifying to me was the reaction of Italians themselves. I didn't write the book for Italians. I wrote the book, I think, for those of us who love Italy. We travel in Italy. We there's so much we love about Italy: the art, the food, the wine, the places. But it was so gratifying for me to have Italians themselves be quite startled by this approach and to enjoy it and to be very complimentary about linking history and wine. So that was, I think, very gratifying.
Yeah, I'll bet. Wow. And what was the most difficult part about writing the book?
I think the most difficult part, Natalie, is knowing when to stop. I think this was a book that if I'd had another 2 years, and if my publisher didn't mind how long it was, as it is, I did have to trim 25,000 words, and lose some wines, and that hurts a writer. That's hard to do, to cut words that you spend a lot of time on. But it's a big book as it is. It's 350 something pages, and it's still 120,000 words.
Yeah, it's like cutting a limb, isn't it?
It is a bit like cutting a limb. Yeah. And, that said, I could have gone on and on. There's so many wines, stories that link, that could have linked. There are chapters that could have been written. I think, but, with projects like this, you have to have a deadline. You have to know when to stop, and you have to actually look forward to that book appearing in the world.
Absolutely. I always joke with my editor, if we were back in the days when it was a physical manuscript being taken to the printer, as opposed to everything being electronic, I'd be chasing after the van, going, just one more change. Let me tweak one more sentence. It's like, let go.
Absolutely. Actually, it's easier now to keep tweaking. It's easier to do that, Natalie, isn't it? We can't. Sometimes we keep tweaking because we can electronically, but there was something about packing up that paper manuscript and taking it to the post office, putting it through the post office, forgetting about it.
Absolutely. So was there a wine region that surprised you most? I mean, you're very familiar already with Italy, but perhaps in the research for this book, there was a wine region that really, had some surprises for you.
Well, I think it's interesting because I have an index of wines by region in the back of the book, and I wasn't really aware of that when I was writing the book. I wasn't thinking about. I did want to make sure I had wines from each of the 20 regions, but I look back and I look at where the areas that had the most wines, and they were some of the most exciting chapters. And actually, these areas, these regions, go over many, many different chapters because the stories from Campania, for example, span a number of chapters, and the stories from, say, Sicily or Tuscany as well. So I think Campania to me is very, very exciting because it's one of the most ancient wine regions in the world. You know, we have wines and wine connections that go back to the ancient Greeks, of the Romans, of course, and, you know, through history. But what's exciting about Campania is that we're only now discovering new areas, new grape varieties. There's an area just to the west of Naples called the Campi Flegrei, the Phlegraean fields, the burning fields. This was where the Greeks first settled on the Italian mainland at Cumae. The Sibyl of Cumae sat in her cave and gave prophetic judgments, and I think Lake Avernus was the entrance to the underworld. But the Campi Flegrei wines have only re-emerged in the last 20 years. And they're just wonderful wines coming from the Campi Flegrei, from grapes such as Piedirosso and Fananghina. So I love that we have ancient connections, and yet we can almost approach Italy like a new world country with new wines, new wine areas to discover.
Yeah, what's old is new. And Falanghina is one of my favorite fresh, zesty white wines to have when I'm dining out. I always look for it on restaurant wine lists. So it's interesting that you highlight that. I'm in sync there. Now, in your introduction, you mentioned the idea of wine as a narrative vehicle throughout history. You've mentioned it. Can you expand on that beyond what you've already mentioned?
Well, I think it's a good theme to explore history. You know, I wouldn't have wanted to just write a history book. And I've read a lot of history books, as you can imagine, while researching this book. And I think wine is a way of lubricating history, is one way to look at it. And that these wines that have direct connections with the various chapters, and it's not just the past, we're coming up right to the present, and indeed even looking to the future, perhaps with the Pee-wee wines that are emerging now.
What are Pee-wee wines?
Pee-wee is a type of hybrid grape variety. I'm sure they're being cultivated in Canada, Pee-wee varieties that are particularly resistant to fungal diseases, which of course this past year has been a real problem across Europe, because of the climate change and humidity. So, that's part of the ongoing story. And this connection with history does follow right through, right to the present moment, and the way wine is connecting with the concerns we have about climate change, about so many issues that are pressing to us, whether we're in wine or not. So wine connects us to everything.
Absolutely. I've said it many times, but I always think you could do a liberal arts degree with wine as the as the hub, and then the spokes, religion, geography, science, commerce, agriculture, everything connects. History
Absolutely.
Especially. Yeah.
No, that's actually a lovely idea. I would love to be involved in that liberal arts course and teach one of those modules, and that's a lovely idea.
That would be fun, and then we could develop it further and go in depth into a master's of fine arts in wine and history. You could be the department chair.
I would love that.
You also mentioned, now you've mentioned grapes, new grapes have been discovered, but you also mention in the book specific wines that have almost been forgotten. Which of these do you think deserves the most more recognition?
I think it's really interesting how Italy has more native grape varieties than any other country in the world for producing, in production for wines. But,
how many does it have, approximately?
There are about 600, but probably as many as 2,000 different grape varieties still grown here. But 600 certainly in production. But I think what's really interesting is the story of how some of these grape varieties were only saved by the efforts of really amazing wine producers who believed in the grapes and who worked hard to save them from literal extinction. An example would be the Fiano grape. Now, Fiano, we're seeing a lot more Fiano now. It's not just grown in its heartland of Irpinia, which is inland Campania, but it's grown in Puglia or in Sicily quite widely, a little bit in Calabria, and I'm sure cultivated outside of the country as well. But it was only after the war, after the devastation of World War II, that a remarkable wine producer named Antonio Mastro Berardino believed that the way to rebuild the vineyards of Campania, which had been so ravaged by war, he believed in the native grape varieties, and he believed in grapes like Fiano, and he propagated Fiano, saving it literally from extinction, and began to produce Fiano commercially, I think as early as the early 1960s. So that's one example, but there are a number of other examples of grape varieties that have been saved.
Is Fiano a zesty white wine? I just wanted to clarify.
I wouldn't call it zesty. Yes, it's a
Okay.
white grape. Pliny the Elder referred to a grape in his Naturalis Historia, this great Roman natural history tome. He referred to the uva apianum, this grape that was so sweet that the honeybees were very, very fond of it. And it's conjectured that Fiano was possibly that grape. But it was a difficult grape to cultivate. It suffered from, I think it was during flowering, the flowers wouldn't set particularly well, particularly if there was any moisture. And so you'd have uneven bunches, it was low yielding, and you could see at a time when quantity was the goal rather than quality, that growers would say, well, let's get rid of it, let's grow something more productive. And Fiano is one of those grape varieties that was at risk. Falangina was another one. So those are a couple of examples of grape varieties that the world wouldn't know. And you love Falangina, I love Falangina, I love Fiano. You know, the wine world would be much poorer without these really heroic individuals who believed in these grape varieties and believed in that they were worth saving, that they could make wines that weren't just good wines, but that are great wines that the world will come and love. And I think that the world has, you know, the wine world is at risk of having, you know, too few flavors, too few grape varieties, especially, you know, with varietal, buying wines varietally. You know, we know of a handful of grape varieties: Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc for whites, you know, Cabernet Merlot. These handful Syrah, these handful of grape varieties that can be cultivated around the world, perhaps losing connection with place. But in Italy, we have this wealth of native grape varieties that are linked to place as well. It does make Italian wine confusing, though.
Yeah, it does. It's a challenge. You need a big book like yours to figure it out. And with the homogenization of Cabernet, Chardonnay, and so on, of course, that's not across the globe, but there are more and more that are just sort of your basic chocolate and vanilla flavors. And there's nothing wrong with somebody who wants consistency and wants to know, you know, doesn't really want to dive into the whole thing. But yeah, the wild diversity of Italy is so intriguing. And what I find about Falangina in particular is that it has these floral notes that aren't over the top. For me personally, it's subjective, of course, that aren't too perfumey, but still has this lovely floral quality. Now, you described the symposium and its cultural significance in ancient Greek society. How did this ancient practice compare to modern Italian social wine drinking customs?
That's a really good question. You know, the symposium was an opportunity for people to get together and share wines, but it was a vehicle to discuss, have arguments, to read poetry, to discuss philosophical arguments as well. And I think there's a lot of that in Italian culture today. There's a lot of wine is a vehicle again for pleasure and discussion and argument. And although it may not be so formal as it was in ancient Greek times, I think that when Italians get together and the wine is opened and food is on the table as well, it's an opportunity to provoke discourse. And I would say that's the legacy of the Greeks, this provoking discourse and thought.
Mm-hmm. And so which wine story in your book do you find is most reflective of Italian culture? I know they all are to varying degrees, but is there one that stands out?
Well, I think that Italian culture is so represented by wine in so many different ways. But I think it's the way that Italians are always wanting to try new things but at the same time remain rooted to tradition. And so in my chapter called Tower Power, for example, I talk about Campanilismo, and this is the way that Italians love their own, not just their own region, their own neighborhood, their own city, their own quarter of that city. And that reflects in wine and food too. So it's this love of their own foods are the best, the wines from their own area are the best. And even wines from 20 miles down the road, Chianti Classico from the province of Florence, may not be drunk and enjoyed so much by people that live in nearby Siena. And it's this pride in what is their own that I think is so reflective of Italian culture.
I wish Canadians would that would rub off on Canadians, because we don't. I guess because we're a young wine culture, perhaps we just don't have the confidence yet. Not everyone, but a large majority do not drink as much Ontario wine in Ontario, for example, as we do all other wines. And yet that was also my experience, Marc, when I traveled to both Italy and France. In Bordeaux, all you could get was Bordeaux. And similarly in Burgundy, you weren't, they didn't have California on the list for sure, let alone other French regions. So I love that because it's very, I don't know, there's all the movements these days, buy local, support local, a smaller environmental footprint when you do. I think that's a great and telling kind of characteristic that the Italians certainly do that in spades. Can you talk about a specific historical figure in Italy whose wine legacy impacts us today?
Well, I think I would talk about much more recent. I would say that the wine producer who's had perhaps the biggest impact on wine today would be Marchese Piero Antinori. You'll be very familiar with the wines of Antinori, but he was a revolutionary. He was a revolutionary when he decided in the 60s that to make great wine, he had to make great changes. And I think that the renaissance of Italian wine in large measure goes back to great individuals with vision like Piero Antinori, like Angelo Gaia. And so although that's much more recent, I think what's exciting about Italian wine today is, yes, there's this great link to the past. The Antinori family go back 800 years as wine producers, but they weren't just resting on that history as wine producers. They're still innovating, still producing, making exciting new discoveries. And it was that determination that Italian wine should not just be good. Italian wine should be great again as it once was. That Marchese Piero brought to Italian wine, and I think that really went across the board in every single region. That influence has been felt, and that sense that great wines can be produced wherever you are in Italy, and great wines are being produced in every single one of Italy's 20 regions.
And what specific changes did Antinori make?
Well, for example, Chianti was a wine that was a wine we all knew in the in the 70s, in the 80s. The Chianti, the old style Chianti, in that beautiful bottle that had straw in it, that beautiful fiasco, the flask. But it was a wine that was never meant for aging. You couldn't even lay that bottle down. But the reason was because a recipe had been defined in the 19th century by Baron Bettino Ricasoli, the second prime minister of Italy, incidentally, who wanted to define Chianti wine. And he said that Chianti needed to have a cocktail of grapes, Sangiovese certainly, Canaiolo, Colorino, but also white grape varieties such as Trebbiano and Malvasia to make the wine more supple. But of course that did make an easy-to-drink wine, the wine that we all loved, that brought happiness to Italian restaurants around the world. But Marchesi Antinori really believed that the Chianti region, the Chianti Classico in particular, and this great grape Sangiovese had the potential to produce world-class wines. And so he actually decided to eschew using the recipe for Chianti, using those white grape varieties, and instead he planted some Cabernet Sauvignon in his Tignanello vineyard. Made a wine that was astonishing, vinified in the French manner, and aged for the first time really using new French oak barrique. So this super Tuscan, this incredible wine emerged that astonished the world, but it could only be sold as a vino da tavola, the most lowly classification of Italian wine, because it was outside of the regulations, the definition of what Chianti was. And of course it was not just recognized as one of the best wines, it was a very expensive wine. So we had this anomaly of a vino da tavola, the lowliest wine, being able to command some of the highest prices. So this was a revolution in winemaking in the 1970s, and it really made people rethink their whole attitude to wine across the country, and to the potential for Italy to produce world-class wines that would not only be great, wonderful wines, but importantly could command prices matching, the greatest wines in the world, the Burgundies, the Bordeaux that we've mentioned already.
And was that wine called Tignanello?
Yes, that's right, Tignanello, that's right.
Okay, because I know there's another super Tuscan called Sassicaia that got its own denomination, DOC, later, and also bucked the system, perhaps in Antinori's wake. But, these brands remind me of the way... Go ahead.
No, actually, not in Antinori's wake. The Sassicaia comes from the Tenuto San Guido, which was his uncle. And so and that's a Cabernet based, primarily Cabernet wine that was grown on the Tuscan seaboard. And it was Marchesi Piero who encouraged his uncle to produce this Cabernet-based Super Tuscan, which you're right, absolutely. I think it's the only wine in Italy that has its own DOC, Bolgheri Sassicaia.
That is amazing. And it reminds me of designers in Italy, France, and so on, who lead with perhaps, these beautiful outfits you see on the walkways or runways during Fashion Week that few people could afford or even would wear because they're so outrageous. but they're gorgeous. But then they set the price for everything else. All of the next tier fashions or the purses or the perfumes that people actually buy. But you've got that benchmark leading the way. For lack of a better metaphor, the snowplow in front that's saying, okay, here's the top tier, and then everything can file in thereafter. That sort of new greatness.
I think that's exactly what happened. I think you're right, and it did really lead the way. And And it raised all of the wines, not just the wines selling for really top prices, but it raised the quality standard as well. This sense that
True.
that Italian wine, the determination of small growers to strive for quality, to reduce yields, to plant on the more difficult to cultivate hillsides, for example. So you're absolutely right. I love that analogy.
Great. It's yours. You discussed the influence of Venetian merchants on the wine trade. How did this influence alter wine production standards in Italy during that period?
Well, that's an interesting question as well. Of course, Venice was a maritime republic, so it didn't really initially look inland. It had colonies all across the eastern Mediterranean, and these colonies were areas where wines were being produced. In particular, one area, one port called Monemvasia. And the wines from Monemvasia were brought back to Venice, and they were particularly favored. They were made in the passito style by drying the grapes to make a raisined wine, so not from fresh grapes, to make this rich dessert raisin wine, which was not only a luscious sweet wine that people came to love, but also, very, very importantly, it was a navigable wine. It was robust enough to be able to withstand transport by sea. The Monemvasia eventually came to, it had a number of different names by the time it got to Venice, but it eventually came to be called Malvasia, and so the production moved. Monemvasia wasn't large enough, and it moved to Crete and the Malvasia di Candia. So this was a source of wines. But once the Ottoman Turks took the eastern Mediterranean colonies from Venice, Venice had to turn inland, and it developed its own Venice terra firma, the inland Veneto region that we now know. And these wines began to be produced on the mainland. Same style, but not always the same grape, which is why Malvasia today, there are a number of Malvasias produced all around Italy, but also in other countries as far away as the Portuguese island of Madeira. Malmsey, for example, would be from a Malvasia. But it was more of a, you can kind of think of it, Natalie, as a brand. Malvasia became a brand, a style of wine, and it was the Venetians that really made that brand so in demand.
Now, is this the same grape that I think of as Malvasia, and am I just mispronouncing it?
Yes, that's
Malvasia.
right. I think
Yes.
it can have different pronunciations. I don't think you're
It
wrong.
can have-
but
okay.
It depends on where you are. Yeah.
That's very gracious of you. Okay. I'm okay to be corrected, but just, for those listening who may have heard of Malvasia as well, but we're talking about the same grape in Malvasia.
That's right.
I'll let you say that. Okay. And in your chapter about Barolo, how do you think the royal fascination with this wine shaped its global perception? Of course, it's up in Piedmont. It tends to be very expensive. It has a lot of tannin. It ages a long time. But what was the royal influence?
Well, that's interesting too. That's an interesting story. Piedmont was part of what was called the Kingdom of Sardinia. Now, we think the Kingdom of Sardinia might refer to the island of Sardinia, not much else. In fact, the Kingdom of Sardinia was all of the northwest of Italy, so where Piedmont is, Valle d'Aosta, but also over the Alps into what is now France, what is now the French Savoie, and the family was the Savoia. And the father of Italy's first king, Carlo Alberto the first, loved the wines from Barolo and bought a castle, the Castello di Verduno, in order to produce this wine. So the royal influence was certainly a strong a selling point for the wine. But it's also interesting that the actual style of Barolo, the wine that we could recognize and enjoy now developed and evolved during this period. And that was in part through the efforts of Count Camillo Benso di Cavour, who was to become Italy's first prime minister. He had another castle, a Castello di Grinzane, again in the heart of the Barolo wine area. Now, Barolo is made from the Nebbiolo grape, which is a difficult grape. Nebbia the word nebbia means fog, and it is often late harvested in this season of mists. And as a result, the wine, if not carefully handled, could have some residual sugar. So it wasn't a serious wine in that same sense that it is now. But Cavour brought in a French enologist, French winemaking techniques, and found that through long maceration on the skins, we would get the extract, the tannins, and the power that we associate with Barolo today. So modern Barolo really began in the 19th century with the royal family and with the first prime minister. So it's really directly linked to the story of Italy.
Oh, that's great. And of course, back then, there were no social media influencers. It was the court who set the fashion. So if they were fans, I'm sure that sort of spread out then through the rest of the country. And of course, maceration, for those who are listening may not be familiar with that term, is how long you leave the grape skins in contact with the actual juice of the wine. And as you said, Mark, that the longer, the more it's going to extract, the color, the tannin, the flavor, and so on. What makes a wine heroic?
Heroic wines. And there are many, many heroic wines in Italy. Heroic wines, to me, what defines a heroic wine is a wine that is made at immense effort, much more effort than it would take to make wine from grapes grown on a nice, easy to cultivate pianura, plain area. But for example, the Cinque Terre, grapes, vines cultivated directly on the sea cliffs, incredibly steep, the cliffs held together by dry stone walls. Immense effort to make wines, to harvest wines. The Cinque Terre wines are heroic. They're not necessarily able to command the prices that the effort require, really should reward those producers. Or another example, the highest vineyards in Europe in the Valle d'Aosta, again, immense effort required to tend these mountain vineyards that produce such gorgeous and unique, light, ethereal mountain wines. And again, the prices that they can sell these wines for aren't reflected in the immense amount of hours. Just a statistic, these heroic vineyards might take 800 man-hours per hectare during the course of a year, compared to 100 or 150 for easier to cultivate vineyards in other areas. So it's
Wow.
heroic because of the heroic effort that these wine growers do to make wines that aren't world known. They don't fetch huge prices, but they make them because they've always made them, because their fathers and their grandfathers made them before them, because they like drinking them, because they've always been done. And it's wonderful that Italy still has these wonderful heroic wines that we can enjoy.
Absolutely. Again, what you're talking about just makes me think of so many parallels inside and outside the wine industry. But for those of us who are in Ontario, heroic wines are definitely our ice wines, picked at -8 degrees Celsius or colder, and pellets, little grapes that have been frozen, have been known to break the presses. But definitely heroic. We should thank them for their service. So how did World War II reshape vineyard landscapes in Italy?
Well, World War II was devastating for the wine country. It was devastating for the whole country. World War II was a disaster in Italy. There were battlefields across the country. We're talking about down in Sicily up to the northeast, the northwest. So the wine country was destroyed. The men were away fighting or serving as partisans later after Mussolini fell. So the aftermath of the war, not just the wine country, but the whole economies had to be rebuilt. And wine being such an important element of the economy was part of that story of reconstruction. And some areas, for example, really took that opportunity to almost to reinvent themselves. An area like Friuli, Venezia Giulia. So we're talking about right up in the northeast of the country, with the borders now, today, previously with Yugoslavia, but now with Slovenia, with Austria, and a source of magnificent, varietal, mainly whites, 80% whites, as well as outstanding reds. And the wine growers took collective decisions to concentrate on quality, to replant with native as well as some international grape varieties, and to sell these wines varietally as an easier way for consumers to understand. And that's an example of how one area rebuilt, but it happened across the country. The vineyards of Barolo that we were just talking about were scenes of terrible fighting between, really it was a civil war. It was a civil war between, the partisans and the Italians that were still loyal to Mussolini. So it was a tragic time to have civil war on Italian soil. But afterwards, again, hard times after the war. But belief in the quality of the wine that could be produced was one way that these areas were able to rebuild and recover. And it's just wonderful now that the wines are so well recognized and of such high quality, and people, these wine growers now can benefit from the toil and the effort and the hardship and the tragic times that their grandparents and great-parents had to live through.
Well, yeah, I'm just thinking people who are history buffs and wine buffs are just going to love your book, Marc. And that story itself reminds me of, I don't know who said it, but they talked about the French, especially the Champagne vineyards, being watered with the blood of the French, especially during the war, because these pickers were out in the midst of bombing and all kinds of things. It's just amazing what people did to keep, the vines going. How do the cultural practices surrounding wine in Italy enhance wine tourism, say as compared to France and Spain?
Well, that's an interesting question too. We wrote a series of books, The Wine Roads of France, The Wine Roads of Italy, and The Wine Roads of Spain. And these books came out in the early 90s, so we're going back more than 30 years. And wine tourism in Italy didn't exist 30 years ago. We were knocking on doors, and if somebody was free in there, and you were in Italy, they would be very glad to show you around the vineyards, and probably just as likely to ask you to stay for lunch. And it would just bring you, and this would be famous wine producers or small growers alike. Wine tourism is more recent than it has been in France. The French have always been pretty good at promoting themselves, at selling their wines, and is realizing the importance of people turning up and the farm gate sales of selling wine direct to people driving by. And that's the way a lot of the French have always bought their wines. So in Italy, this tradition of wine tourism is much more recent, but the Italians have really taken to it with both hands now. And wine tourism is a wonderful experience through agriturismo, through places with farmhouse restaurants. And I think it's important to mention as well that Italian wine is above all almost exclusively designed, vinified, made, conceived to be enjoyed with food. So eating and drinking is it's not uniquely Italian, but I think with the Italians, you can't separate the two. And so even if you're just turning up without even making an appointment, you'll be offered some delicious nugget of salami made by somebody just down the road, or you may be going somewhere that has a wonderful restaurant serving local foods, or even indeed a Michelin star restaurant within that winery. So there are any number of possibilities for wine tourism in Italy, and it's hugely enjoyable, hugely welcoming. And my advice would be for people to really embrace that when you're in Italy, and to enjoy this, because it isn't just about single-mindedly learning about wine. You can't divorce yourself from wine and culture and food when you're in Italy. It's a much more holistic experience. You know, sometimes we can be a little bit too precious about wine, talking about it, analyzing it, dissecting it. In Italy, it's there to be drunk, it's there to be enjoyed, it's there to be shared.
Wow, I love that. A holistic approach to life, and especially when you're there in Italy, just soak it all in, everything, including, as you said, the culture. And speaking of that, you relate wine to Italian art and architecture. Can you share maybe an example of how a specific architectural style or art movement directly influenced a wine's, either their branding or their production methods?
Well, I think Italians again are very aware of links with art. You know, going back to the Roman times, and so there are links in branding. But I think you could almost say there's styles of wine that reflect architectural styles, and I'm thinking of a wine called Spoletino, Trebbiano Spoletino from Spoleto, which is a town that was part of the Duchy of Spoleto, which was the Lombards, the Germanic tribe that came down through Italy and almost unified the entire peninsula in the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries. And they had a particular style of architecture that I think almost is reflected in this style of this massive white wine from a grape very few people have had a chance to experience. This Trebbiano Spoletino, very rich, very solid, and even the bottles that producers use to bottle this Trebbiano Spoletino reflect that Lombard architecture with deep punts and heavy bottles, and that to me is an example of a link between architecture and wine.
Yes. Well, and I've seen, I'm sure you're aware of this, but Dolce & Gabbana, the famous fashion designer of Italy, partners with Donna Fugata, and their labels are works of art. I just absolutely... Fortunately, the wine is good, too. It's not just about marketing, but I love that partnership and those cross-influences.
Actually, Donna Fugata have always had strong links with art. Their labels you're absolutely right, their labels are just gorgeous. I love them, and those labels give the exuberance of Sicilian wines. They're such wonderful wines.
They do.
And they really, and I think that's an example of art reflecting the style and the spirit of the winemaker as well. Jose Rallo has this deep love of art and this beautiful, exuberant approach to wines.
And there's always, usually, maybe not always, but usually a picture of a woman, and her hair is always blowing in the wind. And I love Donna Fugata. I will probably butcher this, but Fugitive Woman or Woman on the Run. I put her in my own book, Wine Witch on Fire, because I just love the backstory as well. So it just has such resonance all around. Speaking of Sicily, you touch on the mafia's influence on the Italian wine industry. What can you tell us about that without having to go into hiding? What are the surprising things that may have happened as a result of the mafia's involvement?
Well, you know, the mafia has been involved in just about any form of nefarious activity in not just Sicily, around the world. But in recent years and decades, they have concentrated on infiltrating Italy's great patrimony of not just wine, but these wonderful, protected food products, making counterfeit products and counterfeit wines. And, wine has been something that's been subject to counterfeit since the earliest days. I'm sure in the Roman era there were counterfeit Falerno wines, this Falernum, this famous Grand Cru of the Roman Empire. And you can call a wine anything you want when you put it in a bottle if you fake the label. So there have been huge examples of that, and examples of extortion on vineyards and of ways to get money from the EU subsidies. But the positive story here is that convicted mafiosi have their lands confiscated, and laws have been passed that allow cooperatives, social enterprise cooperatives that bring good to society, to use and make use of those lands. And so vineyards are planted on lands confiscated from convicted mafiosi criminals, and a wonderful range of good, honest wines are being produced, showing that good can come from the horrors that have plagued not just Sicilian society but Italian society.
That's great. Oh my gosh, time is flying here. So, what kind of emerging trends do you see in Italian wine that will shape the next decade?
Well, we've already mentioned climate change, and I don't think that
Yes.
we can, deny the impact that is having on Italian wines, the challenging it's presenting. But I think one of the trends as a result is that we're seeing that organic and sustainable and biodynamic viticulture is one way that vines are more able to cope with these unpredictable climate variations, these great swings in temperature, the droughts that vineyards are experiencing, the huge, massive rain bombs that fall rather than the normal rain we used to get. But vines are resilient, and especially when cultivated organically and biodynamically. So that's a very positive development. I think we're going to see more wines produced in a more natural style. Natural wines being this all-inclusive term that I know you've discussed at times, when we're talking about wines with lower levels of sulfites, of added sulfites, and with skin contact styles of wines as well. So we're, in a way, the future of Italian wines goes back in some sense to the past, to how wines were made even thousands of years ago.
Yeah, back to the future, absolutely. Well, it's like getting off all the drugs and living more naturally. You are more resilient as a person and a vine. So you have two wines there, Marc. I want to make sure we highlight those. Can you tell us a little bit about them? Maybe hold it up to, I don't know if you have the bottle or just the glasses.
I do. Now, the first one I want to show you here, it's called,
Sure.
It's from Limston Manor Estate. It's called Isabeau Rosé, and it's a vine I'm very proud of because I planted some of the vines in this vineyard in 2018. It's from 3 miles from where I live, and we're talking about the damage that climate change is doing, but climate change also provides opportunities, and I'm sure that wine growers in Canada may be finding this as well, that global warming means that it's possible to make wines in areas that where it was a struggle before. And the English wine industry is a good example of that. It's not just the sparkling wines that are being made, but good still wines, red, white, and in this case, this is a beautiful rosé made from Pinot Noir, grown on the Pebble Bed vineyards. It's quite a Provençal style of Pinot Noir. It has a gorgeous soft strawberry fruit to it. There's a really nice crispness to the nose, minerality coming through, and a little bit of salinity.
That sounds great. And for those listening, we will post links to both wines that you have there in the show notes so that people can look for them. That sounds lovely. What is the other wine that you have?
The other wine is we discussed how Chianti evolved, that move from the Chianti of old in the Fiasco to Chianti now being one of Italy's greatest wines. And so I've brought a Chianti Classico. It's Poggio Rosso. It's a Gran Selezione from the San Felice estate, an estate that also has wonderful wine hospitality. The Borgo San Felice is a really chateau with a Michelin star restaurant, so it's wine hospitality at the highest level, and the wines are of the highest level. This is a absolutely beautiful 100% Sangiovese from a single vineyard, the Poggio Rosso vineyard. Immense selection in the vineyard, low yields to make a really beautiful concentrated Chianti Classico with elegance and depth and
that sounds like it would pair well with Italian cuisine, like especially the heartier meat dishes. Yes.
Absolutely. This is a serious big wine.
I think you
what I love
paused there
about
for
the
a
wines
moment
from
there.
San Felice,
Not sure if
is
you're
they
frozen a
have
little bit there, Marc.
freshness. It's not a.
Can you still hear
the
me?
beautiful freshness of the San Felice wines. Can you hear me now?
We'll just see if it comes back.
Oh, I can see. I'm trying to reconnect.
I think I can hear you.
It seemed to have. How about there? Am I back? Am I back now?
You're back now, I think. Yeah. That's okay. Sometimes that happens because of the Wi-Fi. Don't worry about it. We'll just keep going. Wonderful wine.
Yes, I was just saying, it's what I love about the San Felice Chiantis is the freshness. It's 400 meters above sea level, so quite a high vineyard. And even with these heat wave summers we've been having, these beautiful, elegant wines with a freshness and an acidity are produced. They're not big blockbusters. They're really beautiful and well balanced.
That sounds marvelous. And again, we'll put a link in the show notes. So we're going to have to go into the lightning round to wrap this up because the time has flown. A great conversation. If you could share a bottle of wine with any person outside the wine world, living or dead, who would that be? And which wine would you open?
It would be Pliny the Elder, that great historian that I mentioned, the Roman historian who was standing in his villa at Miseno in AD 79, watching in horror when Vesuvius erupted and buried the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. I would love to share a wine with him, probably from the Campi Flegrei, the Phlegraean fields.
Fields of fire. And if you could put up a billboard in downtown London or Rome, what would it say?
Well, in London it would definitely, and I'm going to be political here, it would say Remain, because I think Brexit has been the biggest mistake that's been made in this country.
All right. Okay, I'll drink to that. And do you have one last wine tip to share with us that can make us more wine savvy?
Yeah, my wine tip, Natalie, and I'm sure you would agree with this, is to be adventurous, particularly in Italy, where we have this wealth of names of grapes that people, may not have heard of before. So my tip would be, when you look at an Italian wine list, when you're traveling in Italy, don't pick the familiar. Pick a wine you've never heard of. Ask about it, enjoy it, and really, discover new things. So get out of your comfort zone and discover new things. And Italy has such a wealth of wines to discover that you'll just have surprise after surprise, and I think you'll have very few disappointments.
I love that. As we wrap up, is there anything we haven't mentioned, Marc, that you'd like to say now?
Natalie, I've really loved talking to you. You've asked me some questions that have made me think, and I just know your own love of wine and your own curiosity in discovering. So I think I've really loved our conversation, and I think we've covered a lot of ground. So thank you.
I have too, Mark. And where can we, if you have your book there, please hold it up.
Do.
Remind us of the title, Italy in a Wine Glass,
Italy
and the
in a
subtitle.
Wine Glass. The story of Italy through its wines. This is the U.S. and Canada cover, and it's coming out on May 28th. So it's coming out.
Well, by the time we'll schedule this podcast and this video so that your book is available wherever you get books, whether it's online or in bookstores. So we'll make sure that people are listening to this or watching the video when they can actually buy your book. Because as I said, I think if you love wine or you love history or both, you're just going to love Marc's new book. So congratulations on this new effort, Marc. It's a wonderful, wonderful, remarkable achievement.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this.
All right. I will say goodbye for now, but don't log off just yet. But I look forward to sharing a glass with you in person next time.
Me too. I really look forward to that.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye for now, Marc.
Bye.